They call me Koa. I'm one of the last in our tribe who remembers the old ways, the stories that bind us to the land. To outsiders, those stories are just myths, echoes of a past they've long stopped listening to. But the land remembers. And so do I. When those campers died in the red canyons of Utah, the rangers called it an accident. A rock slide, they said. Unlucky hikers caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I've lived long enough to know that luck has nothing to do with what happens in the desert. It's not just wind and stone out there. There are things in the shadows, things older than any of us, and they don't take kindly to trespassers. It was a cold evening when the park ranger came to my home, his face pale and drawn. His name was Jake, a good man, one who respected the land even if he didn't fully understand it. He told me about the campers, 4 young men from the city, full of energy and arrogance. They'd ignored the signs, gone off the marked trails to a place the locals call Anuskai, the Whispering Wound. It's a jagged chasm, deep and narrow, where the wind howls like a living thing. No one from our tribe goes there. Jake wanted answers. He thought maybe I'd heard a story, some old tale that might explain what they found. He didn't need to describe it. I could see the horror in his eyes, but I asked anyway. Sometimes, saying it out loud helps the truth settle in your chest. They were shredded, he said, his voice trembling. Not by an animal, not by anything I've ever seen. I nodded, the weight of his words pressing against my chest. I poured him some tea and sat him by the fire. I'll tell you what I know, I said, but you must listen carefully, and you must not share this with anyone who would mock it. He nodded, and I began. Long before your people came to this land, the canyon belonged to the Toksha, the shadow hunger. It is said that it came from the deepest part of the earth, drawn to the surface by the suffering of the living. The Toksha does not hunt like a wolf or a mountain lion. It waits, hidden in the cracks and crevices of the rock, feeding on fear. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. The old stories say it is shaped like a man, but wrong. Too tall, with limbs that bend in ways they shouldn't. Its skin is gray like ash, and its mouth is filled with teeth sharper than any knife. But it is the eyes you must fear most, black as night and endless as the void. They say if you look into its eyes, it shows you your death. Jake shivered but didn't interrupt. 100 years ago, there was a hunting party that wandered into the Whispering Wound. They were young and brave, just like those campers, and they laughed at the warnings of the elders. They found themselves in the heart of the canyon as the sun set, and that's when it came for them. The Toksha didn't kill them all at once. It separated them, driving them deeper into the maze of rock. One by one it took them, leaving behind only scraps of bone and cloth. Only one man escaped, and he was never the same. He couldn't speak, couldn't eat. He just sat by the fire every night, staring into the flames, until he finally walked into the desert and didn't come back. I paused, letting the weight of the story settle. The fire crackled between us, the shadows on the walls dancing like they knew the tale. The Toksha doesn't come for just anyone, I continued. It feeds on those who disrespect the land, those who take without giving. The campers, they carved their names into the rock, didn't they? Jake's eyes widened. How did you? The land told me, I said. It always does. They marked the stones, laughed at the stories, and thought themselves above the spirits of this place. The Toksha saw their arrogance, their fear, and it answered. Jake sat in silence for a long time, staring into his cup. Finally he spoke. Is there a way to stop it? To keep it from happening again? I shook my head slowly. You can't stop it, but you can respect it. Mark the boundaries, close the trails, and tell the stories, not just to scare people, but to remind them. The land is alive, and it remembers. He nodded, his face grim but determined. He left soon after, and I haven't seen him since. But I heard the Park Service close the Whispering Wound, declaring it unsafe for visitors. They didn't tell anyone why, of course, just another canyon off limits to the curious. But I know the Tokcha is still there, waiting in the shadows. It always will be, as long as there are those who forget the stories and wander too far. So if you ever find yourself in the red canyons of Utah, remember this. The land has eyes and the shadows have teeth. Stay on the trail, leave no mark, and never, ever go near the whispering wound. Because if you do, the Tokcha will be waiting. My name is Noden. I'm a Navajo guide in northern Arizona, and I've spent my life tracing the paths my ancestors carved through these lands. The red rock canyons, the winding trails, and the whispering pines. They're in my blood. I guide visitors through these rugged terrains, but I always warn them, these aren't places to tread lightly. Respect the land, or it will remind you why it was here before us. Last fall, a young couple from Chicago hired me for a 3-day hike into Antelope Canyon. They wanted to see what the brochures promised. Sunbeams slicing through narrow walls of stone, a natural cathedral of light and shadow. But the canyon has another side, one the photos don't capture. I told them we'd be following the trails my grandfather used, ones that wind deep into the rock far from the Instagram crowds. The first day was uneventful. We set up camp just before sunset on a flat patch of sandstone. The tourists, Mark and Jessica, seemed nice enough, though they were oblivious to how quiet the desert gets at night. Around the fire, I shared some of the old stories my grandfather used to tell me as a boy. They listened politely, though I could tell they thought they were just campfire tales. I didn't tell them everything. My grandfather believed the canyons were alive, not just with animals, but with things older than memory. He called them Nautseie, the shadows that hunt. They take many forms, but always from the edges of sight. He warned me never to wander too far from the firelight. As a child, I didn't understand the weight of his words. As an adult, I've seen enough to believe. That night as the wind scraped the canyon walls, I felt it again. That same weight pressing on me like an unseen hand. Something was watching us. I didn't say anything. What could I say? Don't worry about the shadow monster that lives out here. No one pays a guide to scare them. Still, I made sure the fire stayed strong. It wasn't until the third night that Mark and Jessica noticed the silence. By then, it was too late. We'd made it deeper into the canyon than I'd planned. A wrong turn added hours to our hike, and the sun was dipping below the rocks by the time we found a place to camp. I felt uneasy. The wind had changed. It was too still, too warm for this time of year. The desert felt wrong. I told myself it was just fatigue, but as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the sensation that we weren't alone. Jessica was the first to hear it. A low, guttural sound, like the groan of rocks shifting deep underground. She thought it was the wind, but I knew better. Wind doesn't stop and start like that. It doesn't grow louder, closer. Mark laughed it off, brushing aside her concern. Probably just a coyote, he said. I wanted to believe him, but no coyote I've ever known sounds like it's dragging claws over stone. The firelight flickered as the sound circled us, moving faster than any animal should. Jessica was clutching Mark's arm, her wide eyes reflecting the flames. I kept my voice calm and told them to stay by the fire. I didn't tell them what my grandfather always said. The Nautse don't fear the fire, but they wait for it to die. The first glimpse came just after midnight. A shape, darker than the shadows it moved through, passed between the rocks. Mark saw it too, his bravado cracking as he muttered something about an owl. But owls don't have limbs that bend wrong, or faces that stretch into something almost human. It's just a trick of the light, he whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it true. I knew better. I knew it was testing us, circling closer with each pass. The stories say the Nautse take their time, feeding on fear before they strike. I kept the fire high, stoking it with every dry branch I could find, but the wood was running out. Around 3 a.m., Jessica screamed. Mark and I spun around to see her pointing at the edge of the camp. Something crouched there, its outline barely visible against the rock. It didn't move like anything I'd ever seen, its joints snapping and twisting as it rose to full height, taller than any man, its limbs impossibly long. "Run!" I said. My voice was steady, but my heart was pounding. "Run! And don't stop until I tell you." They hesitated, but only for a moment. Mark grabbed Jessica's hand and they bolted down the trail. I stayed behind, holding my grandfather's old knife in one hand and a burning branch in the other. The creature didn't follow them. It was focused on me. Its eyes glowed faintly like embers buried in ash. I could feel its hunger, its malice, as it took a step closer. The fire crackled between us, the only barrier keeping it at bay. I swung the branch, sending sparks into the air, but it didn't flinch. Then it spoke. The voice was low and broken, like wind through shattered glass. It said my name. Nodin. I don't remember running, but I must have. I found Mark and Jessica huddled by the trailhead hours later, pale and trembling but alive. We didn't talk about what we saw. What could we say? When I got back to my village, I visited my grandfather's grave. I knelt by the stone and whispered a prayer, asking for his guidance, his protection. The canyon is still there, still waiting. But I haven't gone back. The Nautse don't leave the places they claim. They wait. And if you wander too far from the firelight, they'll find you. My name is Eli Blackfeather. I've lived my whole life near the sprawling wilderness of the Black Hollow National Forest, a place so vast and untouched that it feels like stepping back in time. Growing up, my grandfather filled my nights with stories of spirits, creatures, and forces older than the trees themselves. I used to dismiss them as tales meant to keep kids from wandering too far. But that changed one fall evening when I was 26. I'd taken a job as a seasonal park ranger. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved being out in the wild, away from the hum of modern life. My shifts often involved long patrols through remote trails, ensuring hikers and campers were safe and accounted for. Most of the time, it was peaceful. The forest had its rhythm, its sounds, birds chirping, wind rustling through leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. But that night, the woods were off. It began subtly. The usual background noise of the forest seemed muffled, as if the trees were holding their breath. Even the wind, which had been steady all day, stopped. I remember glancing at the sky. The sun was dipping low, casting everything in a deep orange glow, but the air had grown unnervingly cold. My radio crackled to life, pulling me from my thoughts. "Eli, you there?" It was Clara, the other ranger on duty. "Yeah, what's up?" I replied, relieved to hear a human voice. "We got a report of a missing camper, last seen on the Willow Creek Trail. Can you check it out?" Willow Creek Trail was about an hour's hike from where I stood. It's not a trail for beginners, winding through dense woods and rocky terrain. A missing camper there wasn't unheard of, but the unease in Clara's voice made my stomach twist. "On it," I said, grabbing my flashlight and map. The trek to Willow Creek was uneventful, but the silence pressed heavier with each step. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had vanished, leaving the forest in near total darkness. My flashlight beam cut through the void, illuminating the dirt path and the occasional pair of glowing eyes from curious wildlife. About a mile in, I found something. A backpack, torn and scattered, its contents strewn across the trail. A chill ran down my spine as I crouched to inspect it. The tears weren't from an animal. They were too precise, too deliberate. The straps looked as if they'd been sliced clean through. My radio crackled again. "Eli? Any sign of the camper?" Clara's voice was static-filled. "I found their pack," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It's ripped up. Looks like it was cut." There was a long pause before she replied. "Be careful. Let me know if you find anything else." I stuffed the scattered belongings into the ruined pack and slung it over my shoulder. Something about the air felt heavier now, like I was being watched. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the darkness seemed to press in on me, almost tangible. I smacked the light against my hand, and it stabilized, but my nerves were shot. That's when I heard it. A low guttural sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too human. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, this time closer. A mix between a growl and a rasping whisper. My grandfather's stories flooded back to me. Tales of the Wendigo, a creature born of hunger and madness, said to stalk the deep woods. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response, just the sound of crunching leaves moving slowly, deliberately toward me. My heart pounded as I swung my flashlight in the direction of the noise. The beam caught movement. A shadow, too tall and too thin to be a person. It moved unnaturally, jerking with each step. My breath caught as the figure stepped into the light. It was gaunt, almost skeletal, with skin stretched tight over its frame. Its eyes were hollow pits, glowing faintly, and its mouth was too wide, filled with sharp, yellowed teeth. It tilted its head, studying me, and then it smiled. That smile will haunt me for the rest of my life. I didn't wait. I bolted down the trail, my flashlight bouncing wildly. The thing let out a bone-chilling screech and gave chase. Its footsteps were impossibly fast, closing the distance no matter how hard I pushed myself. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't dare stop. The trail forked ahead. Without thinking, I veered left, hoping to lose it. The path narrowed, branches clawing at my face and arms. I could still hear it behind me, its raspy breaths, and the occasional snapping of branches. And then, silence. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for air, my ears straining. Nothing. Just the oppressive quiet of the forest. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The trail was empty. For a moment, I thought I'd lost it. Then I heard the whisper. Eli. My blood turned to ice. It knew my name. I spun around and there it was, crouched on a low branch, its empty eyes locked on mine. Before I could react, it lunged. I threw myself to the ground, feeling its claws graze my shoulder. Scrambling to my feet, I sprinted blindly into the woods, branches tearing at me, my flashlight forgotten. I don't remember how long I ran. By the time I collapsed, exhausted and bleeding, I'd somehow made it back to the ranger station. Clara was there, her face pale as I burst through the door. She took one look at me and grabbed the first aid kit. "What happened?" she demanded, but I couldn't find the words. How do you explain something like that? I quit the next day. I couldn't go back, not after what I saw. To this day, I don't hike alone and I never go near Black Hollow. The locals have their theories about what stalks those woods, but they all agree on one thing. When the forest goes quiet, you'd better leave. I don't know if it was a Wendigo, a spirit, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. There are places in this world where the old stories are more than just stories. And sometimes they're all that's left to warn us. I've always been proud of my roots, proud of who I am. My name is Nahele, and I'm part of the Diné, the people you might know as Navajo. I grew up in the shadow of the mesas, where the land stretches out like an ancient canvas, its red and gold hues whispering stories older than time. My grandfather, Hastien, was the tribe's storyteller. His words carried the weight of generations, weaving tales of spirits, creatures, and warnings etched into our oral traditions. One summer he told me a story that I couldn't shake. It was about something he called the Nahukos Biaji, or the Dark Walker. According to him, it was an ancient thing, older than even the first settlers. It prowled the deep forests of the north, the ones where the pines grow so thick they blot out the sky. He told me, if you're ever in the trees and the wind goes silent, run. It doesn't like noise. I thought he was just trying to scare me, until last year when I went camping in the Gila National Forest with my cousin Micah. Micah wasn't one for tradition. He liked the outdoors but didn't care much for the stories that came with them. We'd planned a weekend hike deep into the forest, just the two of us. It was supposed to be simple. 2 nights, 3 days, no cell phones, just the wilderness and a couple of fishing poles. The first day went smoothly. We hiked up a ridge and set up camp near a small, cold stream. The air smelled crisp, pine mingling with the faint dampness of moss. That night, as we sat around the fire, I caught Micah smirking at me. "Hey, Nahili," he said, tossing a stick into the flames. "What's that thing your grandpa always talked about? The dark something?" I rolled my eyes. "The dark walker. And yeah, you'd better hope you don't run into it out here." He laughed. "Right. The evil forest ghost that hates noise? Sounds like it'd hate me." The crackle of the fire filled the space between us. I didn't want to admit it, but I'd been feeling uneasy ever since the sun dipped below the horizon. The wind, which had whispered through the trees all day, had gone completely still. It was unnerving, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The second day, the tension only grew. We hiked deeper into the woods, the towering pines casting long shadows even at noon. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often I'd hear faint rustling, but when I turned, there was nothing. Just the dense underbrush and the towering trees. Micah didn't seem to notice. He was too busy joking about catching trout big enough to make us rich. But I noticed, and by the time we reached our next campsite, my nerves were shot. That night, we didn't light a fire. Micah said it was a waste of matches since we were turning in early. I didn't argue. I just wanted to sleep. But as I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the canvas of our tent, I heard it. A low, rhythmic thumping. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like someone was beating a drum far off in the woods. I nudged Micah. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He groaned. "It's just the wind." "No," I said. "Listen." The sound wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the ground. We stayed up the rest of the night, sitting back to back with our flashlights on. The drumming stopped after a while, but the silence that followed was worse. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making your own heartbeat sound deafening. By morning, we were both on edge. Micah suggested we pack up and head back to the car. I didn't argue. The sooner we were out of those woods, the better. But as we started down the trail, we realized something was wrong. The path we'd followed the day before was different. The trees seemed closer together, the underbrush thicker. And then we saw the first totem. It was a crude figure made of sticks and bones, strung together with what looked like sinew. It dangled from a low branch, swaying slightly despite the still air. Micah cursed under his breath. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I said, though I recognized the design. My grandfather had shown me something similar in one of his stories, a marker meant to warn travelers they were crossing into forbidden territory. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. Micah nodded, for once not making a joke. The further we walked, the more totems we saw. Some were small, like the first, but others were enormous. Entire trees bent and woven into grotesque shapes. And then, just as the sun dipped low on the horizon, we found the cave. It wasn't on our map. The opening was jagged, like the earth had torn itself apart to reveal the darkness beneath. Around the entrance, claw marks raked the stone, deep and deliberate. "We're not going in there," I said firmly. Micah didn't argue. He just stared at the cave, his face pale. That's when we heard it. A guttural, bone-rattling growl that echoed through the forest. It wasn't the sound of a bear or a cougar. It was something deeper, more primal. We ran. I don't remember much about the run back to camp. Branches whipped at my face, roots snagged my feet, but I didn't stop. All I could think about was getting as far away from that cave as possible. When we finally reached the clearing where we'd camped, it was completely destroyed. Our tent was shredded, our gear scattered, and in the center of the chaos was a massive footprint, sunk deep into the earth. It had too many toes. "We have to go now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Micah nodded, his face ashen. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. To this day, I don't know what we saw in those woods. I've tried to convince myself it was just a bear, or maybe some pranksters messing with us. But deep down, I know the truth. The Dark Walker is real, and it doesn't like noise. I was 12 the first time I heard the howling. My name is Daniel, though most folks in the tribe just call me Danny. Elk Creek runs through the heart of the valley, surrounded by dense woods and steep cliffs that seem to hold the world together like a cracked bowl. The place has always felt alive, not just with birds and animals, but with something deeper, older. Elders would talk about it when the fire burned low, stories about things that didn't have names, or ones they wouldn't dare speak aloud. Back then, I didn't think much about the stories. They were just tales told to keep kids like me from wandering too far into the woods. But that changed one bitter autumn when my cousin James and I went hunting. James was 18 and full of himself, the kind of guy who thought rules were optional and that nothing out there could scare him. He had just gotten his first rifle, a bolt-action .22, and wanted to prove he could bring home a buck before the season ended. My mom told me not to go, but James had a way of getting me to follow along. So we left at dawn, the frost still clinging to the ground like a silver veil, and headed into the woods near Elk Creek. The day started normal enough. We followed deer tracks along the ridges, the crisp air biting at our noses. The forest was alive with the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch. Around midday, we reached a clearing with an old stone cairn in the middle. It was nothing fancy, just a pile of rocks mossed over with age, but something about it made my skin prickle. "We should keep moving," I said, trying to sound casual, but James just laughed. "What, scared of some rocks?" he teased, kicking one loose. "It's just a marker." I didn't know much about the old stories then, but I did know enough to feel uneasy. That cairn wasn't just a marker, it was a warning. Still, I didn't argue. James was the one with the gun, and I wasn't about to let him call me a coward. We moved deeper into the woods, and that's when things got strange. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just the sound of our boots crunching through dead leaves. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, even though the sky above was clear. James shrugged it off, muttering about how the deer were probably just spooked by something, but I could see it in his eyes. He felt it too. It wasn't long before we found the tracks, massive, clawed impressions in the dirt, too big to belong to any bear I'd ever heard of. They led away from the creek, disappearing into a thicket of brambles that looked like they'd been smashed through by something huge. James crouched down to examine them, his cocky grin faltering. "Maybe it's a bear," he said, though his voice didn't carry much conviction. "Bears don't have claws like that," I whispered. The tracks were wrong, too wide, too deep, and spaced far apart, like whatever made them had an impossibly long stride. Still, James pressed on, insisting we follow. He was stubborn like that, always needing to prove something. The deeper we went, the darker it seemed to get, even though the sun was still up. Shadows stretched long and twisted between the trees, and the smell hit us. A rancid, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. James gagged, pulling his sleeve over his nose, but I froze. "That's blood," I said. Sure enough, we found it. A mutilated deer lay sprawled in the underbrush, its body torn open as if something had ripped it apart for sport. Flies buzzed around the carcass, but even they seemed hesitant to land on it. James swore under his breath, gripping his rifle tighter. "We should go back," I said, my voice trembling. "Not yet," he snapped. We pressed on, though every instinct in my body screamed to turn back. That's when we heard the howl, low and guttural, rising into a wailing crescendo that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It sounded like no animal I'd ever heard, like something out of a nightmare. James froze, his knuckles white around the rifle. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The howling grew louder, echoing off the cliffs and seeming to come from every direction at once. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, each note a twisted symphony of hunger and rage. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and writhing like living things. Then we saw it, or at least part of it. Eyes glowing a sickly yellow peered at us from the darkness. They were too high off the ground, too wide apart to belong to anything natural. A hulking shape moved between the trees, its silhouette just out of reach of the fading light. James raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking. "Don't," I whispered, though I didn't know why. Whatever it was, I knew a bullet wouldn't stop it. The thing stepped closer, and I caught a glimpse of it. A gaunt, twisted form with matted fur and limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face was wrong, almost human but distorted, with a wide, toothy grin that sent a cold wave of terror through me. James fired. The crack of the rifle shattered the silence, and for a moment, I thought maybe he'd hit it. But the thing didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a deafening roar, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. "Run!" James shouted, grabbing my arm. We sprinted back toward the creek, the creature's howls chasing us through the trees. Branches whipped at my face, and my lungs burned, but I didn't dare look back. The thing was faster, its heavy footfalls closing the distance. When we reached the clearing with the cairn, it stopped. I don't know why, but it wouldn't cross the threshold. It paced along the edge, snarling and growling, its yellow eyes burning into us. James collapsed beside me, gasping for air. And for a long moment, we just stared at the creature as it melted back into the shadows. We didn't speak on the way home. We didn't need to. Later, when I told the elders what had happened, they nodded grimly. They knew the stories, the warnings. The cairn was a boundary, a place meant to keep the old things at bay. We had crossed it, and we were lucky to have made it back. Now, whenever I hear the howling, I stay inside. Some lines aren't meant to be crossed, and some things aren't meant to be understood. And I'll never go near Elk Creek again. My name is Lena Redhawk, and I grew up on stories. My grandmother, a keeper of our tribe's oral traditions, would often gather the children around the fire and recount tales of the creatures that haunted our lands. They weren't bedtime stories meant to lull us to sleep. They were warnings. Of all the legends, the one that stayed with me was about the Screaming Gorge, a place deep in the Smoky Ridge National Forest. She said it was a scar on the earth where something ancient had been trapped, something that should never be disturbed. For most of my life, the gorge was just a story, until last summer. I work as a guide for visitors exploring our reservation's more remote trails. Most of the time, it's routine, teaching tourists about the local flora and fauna, sharing bits of history, and making sure no one wanders off the beaten path. That summer, a group of 4 seasoned hikers booked a 2-day trek into the Smoky Ridge backcountry. They weren't the type to get spooked easily, and they insisted on going off trail to see something untouched. Against my better judgment, I agreed to take them close to the Screaming Gorge. The first day went smoothly. We set up camp a few miles from the gorge near a quiet stream. As the sun set, one of the hikers, a wiry man named Greg, asked about the stories of the area. I hesitated but decided to share the legend of the gorge. "They say it's a cursed place," I began. "Long ago, a group of hunters ignored the warnings and went there seeking game. What they found was something else. They came back changed, half mad, speaking of screams that came from the earth itself and shadows that moved without light. None of them survived the year." The group chuckled nervously, except for Greg, who seemed intrigued. "So what's really out there?" he asked. I shrugged. "Maybe nothing. But the elders say the land remembers. Some places carry scars that never heal." That night, as the fire died down, I lay awake, unease gnawing at me. The forest was too quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets. Just an oppressive silence that pressed on my ears like a weight. I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a scream. It was distant but unmistakable, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself, raw and guttural. I scrambled out of my tent, flashlight in hand. The hikers were already up, their faces pale. "Did you hear that?" Greg asked, his bravado gone. I nodded, scanning the tree line. The scream came again, closer this time. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. It was something in between. a noise that felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. "We're leaving," I said firmly. "What? We can't leave in the middle of the night," Greg protested. "We can and we will," I snapped. "Pack your gear. Now." As we hurriedly broke camp, the screams grew louder, more frequent. They seemed to echo from every direction, impossible to pinpoint. By the time we hit the trail, my heart was pounding in my chest. The hikers' flashlights bobbed like fireflies as we stumbled through the darkness, the forest closing in around us. That's when we saw it. The path opened into a clearing, and there, at the edge of the gorge, stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long. Its skin shimmered like wet stone under the moonlight, and its head tilted as if it were listening. Then it turned toward us. Its face. I don't have words for its face. It was featureless, a smooth expanse of pale flesh, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. Greg took a step forward, as if drawn by some invisible force. "Don't," I hissed, grabbing his arm. The figure raised one of its spindly arms and pointed to the ground. The earth beneath it seemed to writhe, cracks spidering out as if something beneath the surface was clawing to escape. And then it screamed. The sound was deafening, a piercing wail that made my vision blur and my knees buckle. I pulled Greg back, yelling for the others to run. We plunged into the forest, branches clawing at us as the screams followed. I didn't look back. Didn't dare. All I could do was run. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail, gasping for air and shaking with adrenaline. The screams had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I counted heads, 4 hikers, plus me. We'd made it. Barely. The group was too shaken to speak as we made our way back to the trailhead. When we finally emerged from the woods, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, Greg turned to me. "What was that?" I shook my head. "I don't know. And I don't want to know. I've never taken another group near the Screaming Gorge. I warned the reservation council about what we saw, but they only nodded solemnly as if they already knew. My grandmother's words echo in my mind to this day. Some places carry scars that never heal. I don't tell the story to scare people. I tell it to remind them. There are places in this world that don't belong to us. Places where the earth's wounds still bleed. And sometimes if you're not careful, you might hear them scream." My name is Aketa. I grew up on the Pine Ridge Reservation, where the Badlands meet the Black Hills. These lands are sacred. Our elders say they hold the spirits of our ancestors, but they also warn of other spirits, ones that don't bring wisdom or guidance, ones that hunt. It was late spring, the kind of season when the prairie winds carry the smell of blooming wildflowers. I'd taken a job as a seasonal park ranger, patrolling the trails and campsites scattered across the hills. It wasn't glamorous work, checking permits, giving directions, occasionally shooing off a curious bear. But it felt good to protect the land my people have always called home. That year, there were rumors among the staff about missing hikers. 3 people, all of them seasoned outdoorsmen, had vanished without a trace over the past month. Officially, the Park Service blamed it on poor preparation or dangerous terrain, but everyone on Pine Ridge knew better. Our elders spoke in hushed tones about the Vidikau, a creature of hunger and shadow. It's not a story we share lightly, but if you grew up here, you learned to listen. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was patrolling a remote trail that wound through the foothills. It was just before dusk, the golden hour when the landscape seems alive with light. I was walking back to my truck when the woods fell silent. If you've spent enough time outdoors, you know the sounds. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. But when the forest goes quiet, it's like the land itself is holding its breath. I stopped, gripping the strap of my rifle, and scanned the trees. Something was watching me. At first, I thought it might be a mountain lion. We'd had a few sightings recently, and they're known to stalk their prey before attacking. But this didn't feel like an animal. The air had a heaviness to it, as if something ancient and malevolent was pressing down on me. I turned slowly, keeping my breathing steady, and saw it. Just a flicker of movement between the trees, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, with skin the color of ash. It moved with a strange, jerking gait, as if it didn't belong in this world. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and calculating. I don't remember making the decision to run, but I did. My boots pounded against the trail as I sprinted toward the truck, my pulse roaring in my ears. The woods blurred around me, the trees leaning in like they were trying to block my path. I could hear it behind me, its steps unnaturally fast, crunching leaves and snapping twigs with every stride. By the time I reached the truck, my hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the keys into the ignition. I floored it, gravel spraying as I sped down the narrow dirt road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. Whatever it was, I knew it was still out there, waiting. That night, I visited my grandmother. She's the keeper of our family's stories, and if anyone could explain what I'd seen, it was her. I described the creature, its unnerving movements, the way it seemed to sap the life from the forest around it. She listened silently, her expression grim. When I finished, she nodded and lit a bundle of sage, waving the smoke around me in slow, deliberate motions. "You've seen the Vidicau," she said. "It's a spirit of hunger, a reminder of what happens when we take more than we give. It's drawn to those who wander too far, who forget the balance of the land." I didn't sleep that night. The creature's image was burned into my mind, and every creak of the old house made my heart race. I considered quitting my job, but my grandmother insisted I return to the park. "You are a protector," she said. "The land needs you now more than ever." The next day, I went back to the same trail, this time armed with more than just a rifle. My grandmother had given me a small pouch of sacred herbs and instructed me to leave an offering at the place where I'd seen the creature. She said it wasn't enough to protect myself. I needed to show respect to the land and the spirits within it. I reached the spot just before sunset. The air was still heavy, the silence unnerving. I knelt by the base of a towering pine tree and placed the pouch on the ground, murmuring a prayer in Lakota. As I spoke, the wind picked up, rustling the branches above me. It felt like the forest was listening. For a moment, I thought it was over. The tension in the air eased, and the sounds of the forest returned. A bird calling in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as I stood to leave, I saw it again. The creature was farther away this time, perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the trail. Its form was barely visible in the fading light, but its eyes glowed faintly, like coals in a dying fire. It didn't move, didn't chase me, but its presence was enough to freeze me in place. I don't know how long I stood there, staring back at it. Eventually, I turned and walked away, my steps slow and deliberate. I didn't run. Somehow I knew that running would break whatever fragile truce we'd established. That was months ago. The missing hikers were never found, but there haven't been any new disappearances since. I still patrol the park, though I never go back to that trail alone. The Vidicau is still out there, a shadow among the trees, a reminder of the power and mystery of the land. If you ever visit Pine Ridge, remember this. Respect the woods, and they might respect you in return. But stray too far, and you might not come back. They say the canyon watches you. Not in the poetic, nature is alive kind of way the elders like to talk about, but in a more literal sense. The stories have been around forever, though most people outside the tribe don't take them seriously. Just another tale to keep kids from wandering too far, they'd say. But anyone who's lived near White Rock Canyon for more than a season knows better. I didn't always believe it myself. My name's Eli Blackwater, and I grew up on stories about shadowy figures and cursed places. My dad used to talk about the canyon as if it were alive, but it wasn't until I worked as a guide for the summer tourism season that I understood what he meant. It was a hot July afternoon when it all happened. My younger cousin Tessa had begged me to take her and her friends on a hike through the canyon. She was 16, full of energy, and didn't believe in any of the old stories. Her friends, 3 of them, were even worse. City kids visiting for the summer, hungry for adventure and Instagram-worthy shots. I didn't want to take them. Something about that summer felt off. The monsoons had come late, and the air was heavy with a kind of tension you could almost taste. But Tessa wouldn't let up, so I finally caved, figuring we'd stick to the safer trails and be back before sundown. We set out just before noon, the sun baking the canyon walls into a shimmering haze. The sandstone cliffs towered above us, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. The heat didn't bother me much. I'd grown up in it, but the silence did. Normally, the canyon was alive with the sound of birds and the rustling of lizards in the brush, but that day, it was eerily still. Even the wind seemed to avoid us. "Eli, check this out," Tessa called, holding up a piece of pottery she'd found near a dry creek bed. "Put it back," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Why?" "It's cool," one of her friends chimed in, a lanky kid named Luke who clearly thought he was too clever for his own good. "It's not a souvenir," I snapped. "It's part of the land. Respect it." Tessa rolled her eyes but placed the pottery shard back where she found it. I felt a little better, but not much. The canyon didn't like being disturbed, and even a small act of disrespect could carry consequences. We pressed on, deeper into the winding trails. The walls of the canyon seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing darker even though the sun was still high. I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine, blaming it on the heat and the kids' endless chatter. But then we found the tracks. At first I thought they were just coyote prints, common enough in the area. But as I crouched down to get a better look, my stomach turned. The tracks were wrong, too large, too deep, and spaced far apart, like something with an unnatural gait had passed through. They led down the trail, disappearing around a bend where the canyon narrowed into a choke point. "Are those bear tracks?" Tessa asked, peering over my shoulder. "No," I said, standing up quickly. "Let's head back." "Back? We just got here," Luke protested. "This isn't up for debate," I said firmly, my voice leaving no room for argument. "Turn around." Reluctantly, they followed me back up the trail. But the canyon had other plans. We hadn't gone more than a few hundred yards when we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard, and I've heard them all. It was deeper, almost like a voice, vibrating through the air and into my bones. "What was that?" one of the girls whispered, her voice trembling. "Keep moving," I said, gripping the hunting knife at my hip. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the brush. The kids froze, their eyes wide with fear, but I grabbed Tessa's arm and yanked her forward. "Run!" I hissed. We broke into a sprint, the sound of snapping branches and crunching gravel chasing us. The canyon seemed to twist and stretch as we ran, the walls narrowing until it felt like they were closing in. The air grew colder, each breath stinging my lungs like ice. That's when I saw it. A figure stood on the ridge above us, silhouetted against the sky. At first, I thought it was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a long coat that flapped in the wind. But then it moved, and I realized the coat wasn't fabric at all. It was fur or something like it, dark and matted with streaks of red that glistened in the sunlight. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its eyes burned like twin embers, fixed on us with an intensity that made my legs falter. "Don't look at it!" I shouted, grabbing Tessa and pulling her behind me. The others stumbled to a halt, their faces pale as they stared up at the creature. It let out a deafening roar, a sound that echoed through the canyon and shook the ground beneath us. Then it leapt, an impossible bone-cracking jump that brought it down into the trail ahead, cutting off our escape. Up close, it was worse than I could have imagined. Its body was a grotesque mix of man and beast, with limbs that bent the wrong way and claws like jagged knives. Its face was almost human, but stretched and distorted, with a mouth full of too many teeth. I did the only thing I could think of. I threw the knife. It wasn't a good throw, and it barely grazed the thing's shoulder, but it was enough to make it pause. "Go!" I yelled, shoving the kids back the way we came. We ran blindly, scrambling up the rocky slope in a desperate bid to escape. The creature didn't follow, but I could feel its eyes on us, burning into my back like a brand. When we finally reached the canyon's edge, the sun was sinking low on the horizon, casting the land in a blood-red glow. None of us spoke as we made our way home. The kids didn't need to be told to stay away from the canyon. They'd seen enough to understand. As for me, I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those burning embers, felt the weight of its gaze. The canyon still watches. And now, I make sure never to look back.